I want to share with you today the life experiences of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hymel, a brave and noble knight from Louisiana who joined the Knights of Columbus shortly after his retirement from the United States Air Force. In many ways, Robert represents our four founding principles of unity, charity, fraternity, and patriotism. We begin in 1964. The seeds of this future knight's Catholic faith have been firmly planted. He has just graduated from St. Charles High School in Destrehan, Louisiana. The young man moved on to become a graduate of the University of Southwest Louisiana, formerly known as USL, still known today as the Raging Cajuns. Shortly after his college graduation, Robert became a member of an elite fraternity, an Air Force fighter pilot during the Vietnam War. This knight stood ready to defend his country's founding principles. Before his deployment, the airman married the love of his life, Patricia. By the time of his deployment, the couple was expecting their first and only child. The year is now 1972. Robert is promoted from the single seat of the fighter jet to the cockpit of the massive B-52, the Titanic of the sky. His fraternity has now grown. First put into use in the 1950s, the B-52 is scheduled to remain in service until the year 2040. Its expected lifespan of 90 years matches its wingspan. With its massive presence came an immense cost. During the Vietnam War, 31 B-52s were shot down. Its primary means of defense, a tail-mounted machine gun turret, manned by the crew member known as the rear gunner. Positioned alone in the tail section, while the other 5 crew members were positioned in and behind the cockpit. Robert's squadron was stationed in Udapai, Thailand. Under orders from President Nixon, B-52 bombing missions were conducted over North Vietnam to force the communist leaders back to the negotiating table in the hopes of ending the war. In the first phase, codenamed Operation Linebacker 1, 15 B-52s were shot down by Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles. This loss ratio struck real fear in the minds of pilots like Robert Hymel. In December of 1972, Nixon ordered Operation Linebacker 2. Real progress was made in destroying many of the dreaded missile sites. However, because of a rise in the anti-war protests in America, Nixon halted the bombings for one day, giving the North Vietnamese time to relocate their missile sites. On December 22, 1972, Robert Hymel and his crew left Thailand on a mission to Hanoi. Hymel was quoted as saying, "It was extremely tense for everyone. We were concerned about the bombing halt, afraid that the North Vietnamese had used the halt to repair their missile sites." As Hymel and his crew neared their target, he could hear on the radio that other B-52s ahead of him were being shot down. As his aircraft delivered its payload, the rear gunner called out a warning about approaching missiles. Out of his cockpit window, Hymel could see 2 missiles headed his way. The missiles exploded along the plane's right side. According to Robert, it felt as though we had been kicked in the pants. Several engines were knocked out along the plane's right wing. Fuel began leaking out, and the rear gunner was injured. Hymel and the other crew members were unharmed, but convinced the aircraft was too damaged to make it back to Thailand, the order to bail out was given. As can be seen here, the 5 crew members in the front of the plane were positioned in seats that could be ejected from the plane. The pilot, the co-pilot, the electronics officer would be ejected through the roof of the plane. The navigator and the radar operator would be ejected through the belly of the plane. But as for the rear gunner, the bailout would be much more difficult. Alone, the gunner was required to initiate a procedure that would jettison the entire tail section from the rest of the aircraft, leaving the gunner completely exposed to the outside turbulence. He was then expected to free fall from the open cavity. The missile attack made radio communications between the cockpit and the injured gunner very difficult. Hymel could not determine whether the gunner was capable of completing the challenging bailout. Rather than risk the gunner's life, Hymel and the remaining crewmen voted to abort the bailout and attempt a landing at their airbase in Thailand, where there would be medical facilities to treat the injured gunner. Shortly after midnight, the crippled bomber began its descent. Based on eyewitness accounts, it was obvious the pilots on board were having extreme difficulties controlling the plane. In addition to coming in too high, the plane continued to drift off its landing path towards a row of fuel tankers. At the last second, it became obvious to Hymel the landing needed to be aborted. Full power was employed for a second approach. The plane climbed at such a steep rate, the engines began to stall. As the pilots struggled to level the plane off, they were unable to regain control. The engine stalled, and the plane plummeted to the ground. Captain Brent Diefenbach, another B-52 pilot, sitting in a crew bus, parked on the runway, watched as the plane pitched up and then fell out of the sky, bursting into flames about a mile beyond the runway. Diefenbach felt compelled to rush to the crash site in the hopes of finding survivors. Though it appeared obvious to him no one could have survived, but something kept drawing him to go. Diefenbach ran out of the airbase, hopped on a Taiwanese bus, headed in the general direction of the crash. When the driver refused to alter his route, Diefenbach jumped off the bus and attempted to commandeer a motorcycle. When his attempts failed, he frantically approached the occupant of a car. Again, he was unsuccessful in attaining transportation to the crash site. Without any other option, he covered the rest of the distance on foot. For a second, Diefenbach recalled, why go on? No one is alive in that inferno. But he felt compelled, almost against his will, to continue. He approached the wreckage, shouting to see if anyone was alive. To his surprise, he heard a voice calling for help. It was Robert Hymel. Diefenbach entered the burning plane, surrounded by exploding ammunition, pressure lines, and twisted landing gear. He made his way into the cockpit, where he found Hymel. Diefenbach later commented, he was so stuck in there, it was just a mess. Things were blowing up, and it was time to go. The crash crushed Hymel's vertebrae, collapsed both of his lungs, broke both of his hands, his left arm, and his right leg. He was pinned under an instrument panel. The pilot next to Hymel had been decapitated. Diefenbach struggled to free Hymel from the wreckage. Given the extent of his injuries, Hymel was in and out of consciousness and of little help to his rescuer. With all the obstacles Diefenbach faced, one feature of the B-52, designed to save a pilot's life, almost cost both men theirs. Just before the plane crashed, the pilots initiated the cockpit seat ejection procedure. The second this procedure was engaged, the pilot's shoulder harness and lap seat belts were automatically tightened down to keep the pilots firmly in place as their seats were to be ejected from the plane. However, the crash occurred just before the seats were ejected. Therefore, Hymel remained pinned in his seat by a shoulder harness and a lap belt that were not designed to be released until after the ejection occurred. Not only did Diefenbach face the near impossible task of disengaging these safety belts, he and Hymel both faced the real risk of being killed if the mounting heat from the fire set off the ejection rockets. After an intense struggle, Diefenbach managed to cut Hymel free. However, he faced yet another obstacle. Hymel's broken leg remained trapped under the collapsed instrument panel. After several failed attempts to free the broken leg, Hymel ordered Diefenbach to amputate the leg before the cockpit burst into flames. Realizing they were both within seconds of certain death, Diefenbach freed Hymel's leg and removed him from the wreckage. With Hymel over his shoulder, Diefenbach managed to get a mere 20 feet from the crash as the cockpit burst into flames. A helicopter and fire truck finally arrived, but no one was able to approach the burning wreckage for other possible survivors. Ironically, besides Hymel, the only crew member to survive the crash and inferno was the rear gunner, the sole reason why the failed landing was attempted. Because the plane had leveled off just before the crash, the gunner, though believed by the pilots to be too injured to bail out, actually managed to jettison the gun turret from the plane and literally escaped from the wreckage on his own. As you can see, the tail section remained intact. This photo shows the opening created by the detachment of the gun turret, allowing the gunner to leave his seat and run from the wreckage. The very person believed by the crew ran away from the crash on his own. All the other airmen were killed. They could have easily parachuted out of the plane, but to a man, they voted to risk their own lives to save the gunner. Hymel was taken by helicopter to the airbase. Given the severity of his injuries, a chaplain immediately administered his last rites. Within days, a telegram was sent to Hymel's wife, Patricia, advising her that her husband was not expected to survive. If the telegram's prognosis was correct, Patricia would become a widow and raise alone the 2-month-old daughter, Natalie, Robert had not met. Through the courage and determination that defined his character, and after a 1.5-year-long hospital stay, Hymel survived. His doctors were astonished by his recovery. His wife was convinced he stayed alive to see his daughter. Although his career as a pilot was over, his courageous life continued. The fatal flight back from Hanoi would be his last. No longer able to fully extend his left arm, Hymel stepped away from the cockpit but remained in the Air Force. His post-Vietnam service included tours of duty in the Desert Storm and Desert Shield campaigns in the Persian Gulf. After 24 years in the Air Force, Robert retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1993, having received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Purple Heart, and the Meritorious Service Medal. During his distinguished military career, Robert moved his family no less than 15 times. As an elementary school teacher, Robert's wife, Patricia, repeatedly put her career second to her husband's service to his country. With each move, Patricia found herself teaching at a new school, regularly delaying her dream of becoming a principal. Robert's retirement provided the couple with its first opportunity to establish a permanent home, to live out their golden years within the same community. Robert wasted no time sharing his passion for life. He joined the Knights of Columbus Council 8183 in Woodbridge, Virginia. He became actively involved in blood drives. By his side remained his loving wife, Patricia, and yes, his only child, Natalie. Yet even after retirement, Robert remained burdened by the loss of his fellow airmen in the 1972 crash. Living by his own motto, "I've been given a second chance, so I'm going to make the most of it," Hymel became a management analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency, known as the DIA and affiliated with the CIA, a position he held for 7 years. The agency's motto, and remember this, using intelligence to light the way of the known against the darkness of the unknown. Because they had not moved in over 7 years, Patricia finally reached her career goal and became the principal of an elementary school in Arlington, Virginia. On a routine morning, Robert was in his DIA office, boxing his belongings in preparation for moving out of this office the very next day. Just after 9 a.m., Robert received a call from Patricia. As a principal, she had just received notice of unusual events occurring in New York. She phoned her husband to express her concern and asked him how thick were the walls in his soon-to-be vacated office. He shrugged off her concerns. She told him she loved him and hung up the phone. From that moment, the morning was no longer routine, because this was the morning of September 11th, 2001. And yes, the office Robert was within hours of vacating was located in the Pentagon, where the walls were thick, but not thick enough. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 was flown into the Pentagon. The impact of the plane was felt by the students and faculty at Patricia's school. Classes were interrupted by the roar of the plane as it flew over the school. A kindergarten teacher actually saw the plane from her classroom window. She commented how low it was flying just before it crashed into the Pentagon. Teachers rushed into Patricia's office, urging her to call 911. In a state of utter disbelief, Patricia evacuated the entire student body into a basement. As principal, she was consumed with one task: ensuring the safety of her 411 students. She would not let them know she was concerned for her husband's life. For hours, Patricia escorted each child up from the basement into a parent's hands. At 6:45 p.m., when the last student was safely on his way home, Patricia finally turned her focus to her husband. Unable to reach him by phone, Patricia sent the couple's only child, Natalie, no longer the 2-month-old baby the Vietnam pilot had not met, now a grown woman with a child of her own, on a frantic search for her father. Convinced Robert had long finished packing up his office for the next day move, Natalie assumed he was back home cutting his grass. When there was no sign of Robert at home, her concern began to mount. She managed to make her way to the Pentagon parking lot, where there was no mistaking her father's car, parked and unattended. Later, Natalie and Patricia learned that Robert was in fact dead. His body was found under a door frame, where it appeared he was attempting to rescue a woman from the fire, when the floors above them collapsed. Nearly 29 years after being within seconds of certain death and rescued from the burning wreckage of his B-52 in Vietnam, Robert died in the burning wreckage of 9/11 in the role of the rescuer, attempting to save the life of another. The altar of freedom was consecrated on the foundation of heroes like Robert Hymel. He was given a second chance at life. Being a true American, being a brave and noble knight, he dedicated that second chance to his country. He is now buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His tomb faces the Pentagon. During his funeral, a B-52 was allowed to conduct a flyover for only the second time in the cemetery's history. Brent Diefenbach, the rescuer who saved Robert's life in 1972, attended the funeral. Ironically, both men had moved to the same area of Virginia and lived within 10 miles of each other without knowing it. The last time Brent saw Robert was the crash in 1972. At Robert's funeral, Brent walked up to Patricia, now a widow, and introduced himself as the pilot who pulled Robert from the burning wreckage. Patricia immediately broke down and thanked Brent for giving her husband that second chance at life. Robert is now a member of the DIA's Patriots Memorial, which commemorates his profound individual sacrifices by remaining dedicated to his country until the very moment of his death. Though his military career began as a member of the elite fighter pilot fraternity, it ended with Robert being alone, as the only member of the United States Air Force killed on the morning of September 11th, and being among the first DIA fatalities on U.S. soil in our nation's history. Robert's life was impacted by the last three major wars fought by our country: Vietnam, Desert Storm, and the War on Terror in Afghanistan. One of the hallmarks of our nation's armed services is the willingness to sacrifice one's life for the sake of a fellow serviceman. Robert's life exemplified that hallmark. After escaping near certain death 3 times within the same night in 1972, Between the initial missile impact, the horrific crash, then the resulting inferno, it is almost incomprehensible that Robert's eventual death would occur while working in what we all thought was one of the most secure buildings on the face of the earth. After beating insurmountable odds in 1972, Robert died while packing his office in preparation for moving it the next day. In so many ways, irony played a part in Robert's life experiences. In Vietnam, he lived against all odds, but in our nation's capital, he died without knowing the odds. In Vietnam, he flew in the face of all odds, while in Washington, he took an office job where there should be no odds, serving in an agency whose motto is, using intelligence to light the way of the known against the darkness of the unknown. During the Vietnam War, Patricia received that dreaded telegram, preparing her to expect her husband's death. She feared he may never meet his only child. But 29 years later, it would be Patricia who would initiate her own telegram of sort by calling her husband and warning him of the attacks of 9/11. She was so close to losing Robert in Vietnam, yet so close to saving him in Washington. In his final bout with irony, Robert, who at the hands of his own rescuer in Vietnam was given a second chance at life, died in the role of the rescuer on the morning of September 11th, trying to aid a female office mate with her escape. Life, whether it's a first chance or a second chance, remains so precious, yet so unpredictable, and sometimes so ironic. While we still struggle to make sense of the senselessness of September 11th, let us not forget the four founding principles of the Knights of Columbus: unity, charity, fraternity, and yes, patriotism, especially patriotism. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hymel was not just a knight by name. He was a knight by principles, your principles. Let his life, and yes, his death, be a constant reminder to us all of the importance of upholding those principles. In an effort to do just that, to remember not only Robert, but the principles he stood for, the Catholic high school from which this young man graduated, St. Charles Catholic High School, intends to build a memorial tower in his honor. A tower to be built upon four pillars, one for each principle that defines Robert and his brother knights. A tower to be known as the Knights Tower. St. Charles Catholic is in the process of raising $5 million for capital improvements to convert its corrugated metal building campus, you see here, into a more respectable campus, with the Knights Tower prominently positioned in the front of the campus and constructed in such a way that students, teachers, parents, and guests will actually enter the campus through the four columns of the Knights Tower, where each of the Knights' founding principles will be displayed, along with the Knight's crest, as a constant reminder of our fallen knight, Lieutenant Colonel Hymel. St. Charles Catholic serves as the only Catholic high school in the civil parishes of St. Charles, St. John, and St. James. The Knights Tower will provide an atmosphere of reflection where the four principles of unity, charity, fraternity, and patriotism will cause students to pause and to ponder life for the remarkable gift that it is, whether through a first chance or a second chance. To make this amazing visual experience a reality, I encourage all Knights of Columbus to rally behind the knight known as Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hymel, who graduated from the Catholic classroom into a cockpit in defense of his country's principles of freedom and democracy, only to have his life senselessly end on the morning of September 11th, and to now rest in peace in the company of so many of our country's other heroes. Your support of this noble cause is greatly appreciated. If you feel inspired to make a donation, you may do so in any one of the following ways. You may mail your support to the Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hymel Memorial Tower Fund, at 100 Dominican Drive, LaPlace, Louisiana, 70068. Or you may call 985-652-3809. Or you may visit our website at www.stcharlescatholic.org and click on the link to the Memorial Tower Fund. On behalf of our shared Catholic faith, I thank you.